Hello, Internet. I'm David Reddish, entertainment editor at QueerTea.com. Today I'm doing something a little bit different. Instead of my usual written review, I'm doing a video review, this time for Avengers 3 Infinity War. It's hard to believe we've only had the 3 Avengers movies because we've been sitting through 10 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that kicked off back with Iron Man in 2008, and since then we've seen a lot of characters and a lot of movies. Fortunately, Infinity War is pretty well streamlined, even as sprawling as it is, and it doesn't commit the cardinal sin that most Marvel movies do, wherein they spend a good chunk of their runtime promoting other movies and other characters that will be out in a few years. With one possible exception in the end coda, everything in Infinity War is about Infinity War, and that makes for a much easier viewing experience than recent Marvel movies. In another welcome change, it also has a fantastic villain. His name is Thanos, and he's played by Josh Brolin via motion capture. If you've seen the trailers, and let's face it, if you're watching this review, you probably have, Thanos is the big purple pruny looking guy. And he's hell-bent on dominating the universe, as all these villains always are. The script to Avengers 3 by Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely does something very, very interesting with Thanos. Something that Brolin, in his performance, he really exploits it to great effect, and that's that they add some layers to Thanos. He's the real main character of this movie. He's the real protagonist who evolves and grows and changes more so than any of the other characters. It's interesting that they would do that with a villain, and it's also interesting that they add a little bit more humanity to Thanos' character than he even has in the comics. In that regard, the movie actually looks at a sort of ethical dilemma that's actually very philosophically challenging, and asks some real moral questions, though the movie seems a little bit afraid of that. More on that in a minute. As for everybody else, I think just about everybody else who has ever been in a Marvel movie is on hand. There are a few notable absences which are never really explained. I won't say who here. A couple of which are addressed in the end credits coda. Again, I'll get to that. But most of the returning actors pull off at least respectable work. Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany were standouts to me as the Scarlet Witch and Vision, the star-crossed lovers. They have some genuinely moving scenes together, even if their plot feels a little bit stretched thin at times. Tom Holland has at least one great scene as Spider-Man, even if that scene is a little bit manipulative. And Chadwick Boseman and Danny Gurira, which I believe is how you say your name, I could be mistaken. The rest of the Black Panther cast, they show up in the third act. They're as charismatic as ever, and it's easy to see why Black Panther was such a big hit. They inject a lot of needed energy into the third act of this film. The other big standout to me is Karen Gillian, who plays Nebula. She's Thanos' daughter. She's from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. Much in the way she stole her scenes in Guardians of the Galaxy, she really steals her scenes here. And that's really interesting considering how much makeup she's under and who she's sharing the screen with. Nebula is a terrific character. She's a grim character. There's a lot more to her, and I look forward to seeing more of her in the next film. As for the other returning performers, though, they don't all fare quite as well. Like I say, most are respectable, but some of them look bored. Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans, chief among them, they look totally bored. Don Cheadle isn't given much to work with. He looks totally bored. Scarlett Johansson looks tired. Sebastian Shaw looks really bored. And I think that probably has more to do with just the sprawling plot. It has more to do with the fact that they aren't given much to do, and that they have to work with some really, really extreme effects. Actors like Benedict Cumberbatch and Mark Ruffalo and Chris Pratt are in some very effects-heavy sequences, and as a result, I think their performances were a little bit uneven. A movie like Infinity War relies obviously very heavily on special effects, and that would include background plating. Most of the action sequences, and indeed some of just the plot, sitting around the table talking scenes in this film, are done with green screen. It's interesting to me that a lot of people who would attack the Star Wars prequels will love this movie. This movie would not be possible without the Star Wars prequels, with all the green screen work that George Lucas pioneered there. I just think that's a little bit of cinematic irony. That aside, the narrative to this film weaves and sprawls and covers the entire universe, literally. And as a result, it becomes a little bit hard to follow the plot. It's impossible to keep track of who's with who, why, where, how long, what they're trying to do, because the plot to this movie is just elephantine. Besides that, the plot is also extremely self-referential. So this movie relies quite heavily on the other Marvel movies in order to make sense. That might seem like an easy prerequisite, but considering we're talking about 10 years of movies, 10 years during which up to like 4 and 5 movies were produced in the same year. That's a lot to ask of an audience, even a diehard fan audience. It's really hard to follow this plot. And as a result, I think that the directors, Joe and Anthony Russo, try to overcompensate with a lot of action and a lot of noise. Unfortunately, that gets really tedious after a while. That's not to say the action's bad. That's not to say the effects are bad. They're both quite good. But it gets old. For once, I would just like to have someone walk in a room and advance the plot rather than sit through 15 minutes of heavy special effects and really noisy, loud action. As I mentioned before, this isn't so much about the Avengers. It's much more about Thanos as a character. As a result, the plot gets a little thin over the 2.5-hour runtime. The movie feels very long. It's never boring, but it definitely feels long. And as for the end twist, which people are already sort of buzzing about, I wouldn't call it a twist so much as a logical progression of where the plot is going. And the big question on my mind is, why didn't they just open the movie with this? It would have been a much bolder choice, a much more interesting choice, and it would have really raised the stakes for the characters. Of course, that also means Disney and Marvel would not have been able to milk 2 movies out of this plot. So given that they're spending $1 billion on it, I kind of understand where they're coming from. I can't really fault them for that. But like most movies that get split in 2 like this, it definitely loses some momentum, and it definitely feels a bit tired by the end. As for the end credit coda, it does explain the whereabouts of 2 fairly major characters, and it does hint at something that's to come. Though, unless you're a really diehard comic book fan, I wouldn't recommend waiting through the 10 or 15 minutes of end credits for it. The scene's not all that exciting, and unless you are very, very familiar with the comics, you're not even going to understand the reference that's made to a forthcoming character in it. The Russo brothers, they're adequate directors, but that's kind of the most I can say for them. The movie isn't bad, it's passable, just like their direction. One thing that was so refreshing about Black Panther was that Ryan Coogler really was allowed to make his own movie, and he put a personal stamp on it. That doesn't happen here. At this point, the Marvel movies feel more like Saturday morning cartoons, where one episode is kind of interchangeable with the next, and a group of producers are making most of the creative choices rather than a writer or a director. Infinity War is definitely an action-packed film. It's a colorful film. It is sometimes funny. It's sometimes very, very confusing. I think most casual moviegoers are going to be confused and probably a little bit frustrated by the movie. But Marvel fans are definitely going to eat it up. They're going to laugh at all the jokes, even when they're not funny. And they're going to love seeing all their favorite characters. Good for them. I'm sure they'll have a great time seeing it. As for everybody else, I don't know how much fun they're going to have. Thanos is a compelling villain. He's an interesting character, but as I said before, the movie seems a little bit afraid to sort of confront where he's going with his story. It's afraid of getting a little bit too dark, even though it's raising an actual fascinating moral dilemma for the character and indeed for all the heroes in the Marvel Universe. Infinity War is not a great film. It's not really even a good film, but it's not a bad one either. On the 4-star scale, I give it 2.5 stars. If you're a Marvel fan, have fun at the theater. Everybody else, throw it at the video screen or stay home. You're not missing much.